Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Batiste. Thanks for joining us. President Trump is back from the G7 summit and is still tasked with negotiating a trade deal with China. In France, the president acknowledged his shifting statements on dealing with China. He praised Chinese President Xi Jinping after he had called him an enemy last week. Mr. Trump also said he believes China is sincere in wanting a resolution on the trade war. CBS News' Nicole Killian has more on the ongoing battle.
The markets opened higher Tuesday as investors hope the U.S. and China can resolve their trade dispute.
They want to make a deal. And by the way, I think a deal is going to be made.
The next round of negotiations is planned for September, but neither side has announced when the talks will begin. Next week, the U.S. raises tariffs from 10% to 15% on more than $300 billion worth of Chinese-made goods.
And the United States, which has never collected 10 cents from China, will in a fairly short period of time be over $100 billion in tariffs. So I think they want to make a deal very badly.
President Trump says the rough patch is necessary to win a better deal with China. During the G7 summit, he also announced a trade deal with Japan.
We're really hindered by a high tariff on our product over there. So this goal would bring the tariff down significantly by entering into this trade deal, and we think that'll just be great for beef industries.
Some U.S. farmers are cautiously optimistic because the details of the agreement with Japan still need to be worked out.
Well, the price never goes up till the grain bins get empty. And once we start sweeping the bottom of the grain bins, then we start seeing a big bump in price.
President Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe say they hope to sign the deal next month. Nicole Killian, CBS News, the White House.
Let's bring in Domenico Montanaro. He's a senior political editor and correspondent for NPR. Domenico, new tariffs are still planned to kick in next week, but China denies any calls President Trump said took place between the two never happened. Is there any evidence to suggest the two sides are any closer to a deal?
There really isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that the two sides are closer to a deal, and there's even some debate within China and amongst the Chinese government on how to approach President Trump, because he's a kind of slippery negotiator. You're not exactly sure who you're getting. You saw him at the G7 say, amazingly, on the one hand, who's the bigger enemy, his own, Federal Reserve chairman, or the person in charge of China saying who's the bigger enemy, and then at the G7 sort of doing a major about face and saying, he's a very strong leader, and he said, look, that's just the way I negotiate. That's one way to look at negotiating. Some people would want to see trust on one hand from the person that they're negotiating with. President Trump instead uses leverage as the total key to whatever he wants to do with China. And you saw the French President Macron say that he was trying to box Trump in a little bit when it comes to China and Iran, because he feels like this kind of volatility could make a real mess for the world economy.
Our latest CBS News poll shows a quarter of Americans believe the president's approach to trade with China will succeed, while 44% think it won't. Is the White House worried about public perception when it comes to China?
Well, President Trump himself said he's the chosen one, so he doesn't particularly care about what the ramifications politically, he says, are when it comes to China. He sees this in the long run when it comes to China as a fundamental campaign promise that he made to people, to say that he was going to fight to try to get jobs back. And what he's banking on is this long leash that conservatives seem to be willing to give him to say, look, hang in there for a little while longer. In the long run, this is going to be good for the United States, and nobody had the courage to take on China before.
Domenico, a recent New York Times reporter, as you probably know, reveals farmers are frustrated with the trade war. It writes, the predicament of farmers is becoming a political problem for Mr. Trump as he heads into an election year. Is that creating an opening in the Midwest for Democrats?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that you've seen President Trump's approval rating, for example, in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, all underwater. Pretty key places, because if Democrats want to win again in 2020, one of those paths is to rebuild the so-called blue wall. And when you've got people in the Midwest, even you look at Iowa or Ohio, even some Democratic strategists talking to me saying that you can't cancel out Ohio. You got to keep that on the board as a place to make a push. Of course, Democrats have their own primary, and Republicans are trying to say, look at how far left they want to go, because they know just how unpopular this president is overall, and that's the strategy. Either make their base stay home or try to have independents either believe that Democrats are too far left or stay home themselves.
As you mentioned earlier, Emmanuel Macron said the uncertainty in the China trade war is bad for markets. The president was specifically asked about his changing statements when it comes to China. Let's play his response.
The way I negotiate, it's done very well for me over the years, and it's doing even better for the country.
Could
I think,
you talk a little bit about
and I
why
do
it
think,
works,
and I do think that. Look, here's the story. I have people say, "Oh, just make a deal, make a deal." They don't have the guts, and they don't have the wisdom to know that you can't continue to go on where a country is taking 500 billion, not million. 500 billion with a B, out every single year. $500 billion. You just can't do that.
What issues could the president's supposed negotiating style cause for the global economy?
Well, certainly that kind of volatility is not something that helps a global economy. You know, the United States is sort of encapsulated where it's one of the only economies that's doing well when you have all of these other potential factors pointing to a potential recession and other countries that are having a difficult time as it is. And, you know, to a bigger point here, if we step back, one of the big reasons why President Obama and the Obama administration had negotiated TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as unpopular as that's become on the left and on the right, the reason for doing that was trying to box in China or box out China from having access to these markets in Southeast Asia that the Obama administration was trying to give the United States a foothold in. But because President Obama did it, President Trump didn't like it. He thought it was too free trade, which could cost jobs in places like the Midwest, where, again, he promised that he would bring jobs back.
The president is also facing questions, as we know, on Iran. Today, Iranian leader Hassan Rouhani said he's refusing to meet with the president unless sanctions are lifted. Yesterday, the president said he'd talk if the circumstances were right. So both sides have conditions. Will the White House budge, do you think?
Yeah, it's kind of chicken and egg, right? I mean, you've got one side saying, you know, unless sanctions are lifted, we're not going to meet. You have the other side saying, unless you dismantle your nuclear arms, we're not going to, you know, lift the sanctions. So they're sort of stuck in the same place. And while those other 6 leaders of the G7 countries want to try to tell President Trump, come back to the table, talk to Iran, look at these measuring sticks that we can get from them to try to reduce the number of nuclear weapons or nuclear material, I should say, in the country. President Trump's not interested in that. He's going to go back to the United States. He's going to evaluate it bilaterally, one-on-one. That's how he likes to negotiate. He feels like he's got the most leverage of everybody else in the G7 countries, and he's not going to relent and say to those countries, sure, Europe, you know, like, yeah, you guys want this thing, I'm going to go for it. That's not President Trump's style. It's not what he's likely to do. I think we're likely back where we've been on Iran and President Trump.
Domenico, before we let you go, the House Judiciary Committee filed a motion to expedite a lawsuit seeking to enforce a subpoena against former White House counsel Don McGahn. That's as part of their investigations as they prepare for a possible impeachment inquiry. The president said McGahn had immunity, but Democrats are calling McGahn their most critical witness. Do Democrats believe McGahn can make an impact?
Well, certainly they think that McGahn can make an impact. I mean, he was mentioned in that Mueller report about some of the firewall that he was between what could have been an even furthering of actions that the president would have taken, for example, like trying to fire Robert Mueller, who was heading up that Russia investigation. So, of course, Democrats want to hear from McGahn. Part of this, though, is how slow the pace is going, and you have to consider that the bookend to all this is the 2020 election. And Democrats want to be able to, if you're going to mount evidence for a potential impeachment proceeding, the last thing they want to do is have that happening in the middle of an election year, right in the hot season of an election year, where, frankly, a Democratic candidate may not even want that to be happening. We know Democratic leadership is trying to slow walk things or say, look, if we're going to do this, there better be an ironclad case. And I think to the frustration of people like Jerry Nadler, the Democrat from New York, who's the chairman of that committee, is saying, how are we going to get all this evidence if the Trump administration is stonewalling us?
Domenico Montanaro, thanks very much for your time.
You're so welcome.